Again, it's college. It's math.
Like us.
Last time we looked at American abundance in the post-war world. Now let's consider the great exception to that abundance, the African-American community, and the way in which the civil rights movement of the 50s and early 60s began to transform its prospects. The Supreme Court's decision in the Brown case, 1954, and then the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 to 6, inaugurated the legal and activist phases of the civil rights movement. By 1965, a combination of lobbying, direct action, and shifts in public sympathy had eventuated in the complete legal abolition of racial segregation. Martin Luther King Jr. and the other movement leaders were nearly all evangelical clergy, bringing the style and idiom of their worship to bear on a pressing public question. The defenders of segregation promised massive resistance to these changes, but in the event they gave way quickly, with only a tiny minority offering active or violent resistance. Success of the civil rights movement, however, did little to alleviate disparities in income and opportunity for African Americans. The next stage of the movement, with disputes over busing and affirmative action, was clouded by bitter political disagreements. The interracial civil rights coalition, meanwhile, broke up in the face of militant black power in the mid and late 1960s. Well, first of all, the Brown decision. Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, which the Supreme Court decided in 1954. It was the culmination of a long period of legal struggle for desegregation, led by the legal department of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. Already, auguries of racial change were coming about. After the Second World War, for example, the American military abandoned racial segregation. A government committee report called To Secure These Rights, published in 1947, condemned America's racial policy as intolerable and in violation of national principles. So President Truman took the step of abolishing racial segregation and discrimination in the armed forces in 1948 and also in federal hiring. That means that when the American Army went to war in Korea, it was desegregated, whereas it had been segregated during World War II. The election of 1948 was also a very important moment in the development of, or it indicators that the racial situation was changing. The Democratic Party of 48 divided on the civil rights question. Hubert Humphrey, who was then the mayor of Minneapolis, gave a passionate speech on behalf of civil rights. He said, quote, "The time has arrived for the Democratic Party to get out of the shadow of states' rights and walk forthrightly into the bright sunshine of human rights." In other words, states' rights is the shelter behind which Southern segregationists maintain their policies, and we ought no longer to permit them to do so. Well, that led to fervent applause from some, particularly Northern Democrats, but it also led to some Southern Democrats walking out of the convention completely to create an alternative political movement and to run their own candidate for president. This was Strom Thurmond, who became the Dixiecrats candidate for president in that election year. Now, 1948 was probably the most surprising presidential election of the entire 20th century, because the Democratic Party appeared to be breaking up both right and left. The Dixiecrats, that is Southern white segregationists, walked out. Another group who left the Democratic Party were the Henry Wallace Progressives. Henry Wallace had been Roosevelt's vice president in 1940 through 44, but he was far less antagonistic to the Soviet Union than most of the Democratic mainstream. And in fact, he was widely regarded as being a communist.